Hello everyone, welcome to CPPR dialogue on geopolitical challenges and transnational human security threats in the Indo-Pacific, scope of India-Australia partnership. Organized by the Centre for Public Policy Research, CPPR, under its initiative, Australia-India Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative Partnership Taskforce for Indo-Pacific Economy, Security and Sustainability. This is the first webinar in the Taskforce Experts Talk series. I am Anusri Suresh, Senior Associate in International Relations at CPPR. The Centre for Public Policy Research is an independent public policy think tank based in Kochi. Our engagement in public policy that began in 2004 has initiated open dialogue, policy changes, and institutional transformation in the areas of international relations and security, livelihood, education, urban reform, health, governance, law, and related subjects. To know more about what we do, please do visit our website www.cppr.in. In today's discussion, we will be delving into the key geopolitical challenges and transnational human security threats in the wider Indo-Pacific region and the prospects for active India-Australia cooperation in the region. So we are delighted to have a distinguished panel of experts with us today. I warmly welcome the speakers for today's discussion, Ms. Sarah Kirlew, Australian Consul General in Chennai, and Professor Ian Hall, Professor at Griffith University, Australia. It's a delight to introduce the chair for today's discussion, Vice Admiral MP Muralidharan, who is the 19th Director General of the Indian Coast Guard and an Honorable Distinguished Fellow of Maritime and Defence Studies at CPPR. So during his career in the Indian Navy, he has held several key operational and staff appointments, including command of 3 warships, and he is a scholar of strategic and defence-related issues with a special focus on maritime affairs. He is also the chair of India-Australia Taskforce. Warm welcome to you to the webinar, sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Anusri. We're actually going to be talking today about the geopolitical challenges and transnational human security threats in the Indo-Pacific. Now, as you know, we live in an increasingly interdependent world that's also changing rapidly. Main reason for it, you would agree, has been the technological advancements. The very fact that we are meeting and discussing this issue over a virtual platform with people sitting in different parts of the world shows the power of technology. As globalization and interlinking economies grow, security issues also are becoming more and more important. And security of nations across the world, the security aspects would also be something that is of concern. Now, globalization of trade and the fact that bulk of it is by the maritime route also raises the relevance and security of maritime domain. It's also important for us to remember that whether we are looking at economy, trade, globalization, technology, or security, there is one interlinked and inseparable issue, which is one of human resources. Right at the beginning of this century, a United Nations report examined the concept of security in the wake of conflicts. And it said, a new understanding of concept of security is evolving, one synonymous with the defense of territory from external attack. The requirements of security today have come to embrace the protection of communities and individuals from internal and external violence. The need for a more human-centered approach to security is therefore something that is called for. And Mr. Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General, had described human security as something that in the broadest sense embraces far more than the absence of violence. It encompasses human rights, good governance, access to educational healthcare, and ensuring that each individual has opportunities and choices to fulfill his or her potential. Now, the dawn of the century also witnessed some strategic shifts in global politics. The most significant change was that the strategic focus itself shifted from Pacific Atlantic to that of Pacific Indian Ocean. This aspect was very succinctly put across by India's Prime Minister, Shri Narendra Modi, at the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2018, when he said that the 21st century destiny of the world will be deeply influenced by the course of developments in the Indo-Pacific region. And he further brought out that India's own strategic outlook towards the region will be that of right from the shores of Africa to that of Americas, will be to promote a democratic and rules-based international orders. And we will work with others to keep our seas, space and airways free and open, and our nation secure from terrorism and our cyberspace free from disruption of conflict. Now, as you are well aware, Indo-Pacific is a multicultural, multipolar region, accounting for nearly 60% of the world's GDP and 65% of the population. It's also a repository of marine resources, both living and non-living. The Persian Gulf here has about 60% of the world's oil and 26% of the natural reserves. The UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, estimates that roughly 80% of global trade by volume and 70% by value is transported by the sea. Of that volume, 60% of it nearly passes through the Indo-Pacific, with South China Sea carrying about 1/3 of the global shipping. So these waters are precious to virtually every nation across the Indo-Pacific, and the geostrategic value of the Indo-Pacific region would therefore be very evident and explain the reason for a number of extra-regional powers who are also looking for bases or have forward deployed their forces, including nuclear-capable ones in the region. China, of course, has over the past 2 decades increased its presence and engagements across the region. So, it would not be incorrect to say that Indo-Pacific region has become the center of 21st century geopolitics, wherein regional and external powers are actively competing and collaborating with one another to counter and expand the interest and influence. Now, here again, we also need to keep our focus on the importance of the islands or island nations in the Indo-Pacific. While they were just once considered good enough to provide warning or surveillance posts, today with the UN Convention on the Laws of the Seas having come into force, national governments have established exclusive economic zones extending well beyond their territorial waters. So island territories have become more important, which is why you will find some nations are even trying to create artificial islands. Now, an overview of the strategic security perspective of the Indian Ocean, Indo-Pacific would make it clear that maritime security has become a very major issue. While the conventional wars across have reduced, what has today become more important is the non-conventional maritime security challenges, also called low-intensity maritime operations. Includes maritime terrorism, piracy, drug and human trafficking, gun running, poaching, or illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing, and illegal gathering of sensitive seismic and economic data. And also threats are emerging to energy security, economy, and environment. Now, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, which took a review of the maritime transport, has also brought in the importance of cyber security, because today the entire maritime industry and its infrastructure is therefore faced, because their all technology has become so intensive, and ensuring cyber security due to the ever-increasing use of cyber connectivity. Now, India and Australia are 2 nations which are very much for a free and open Indo-Pacific. In fact, the official portal of the Australian government states that Australia's future is tied to the stability, security, and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific, something similar to what the Indian Prime Minister had spoken about. And Indo-Pacific shapes our security and prosperity. It is also home to the most dynamic economies in the world. And on the concept of working together for common good in Indo-Pacific, India and Australia have been part of 2 major initiatives. First, of course, is the Quad or the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which also has Japan and United States. Located as we are on the 4 different corners of the Indo-Pacific, we can play a major role in ensuring security in the area. The second initiative is the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, put forward by India to manage, conserve, and sustain and secure the maritime domain. While it was put forward in the East Asia Summit at Bangkok in November 2019, Australia was one of the first nations to come forward and step in and has become a major partner. So what we have is the Australia-India Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative Partnership. So as part of all this, we are also having today's the first conference that we have a seminar on this subject. And I'm very happy that our experts today will be looking at 2-3 key areas: identify the key geopolitical challenges and transnational human security threats in the wider Indo-Pacific region. How do these security challenges impact the national interests of key players in the Indo-Pacific region, especially India and Australia? And what is the potential role of India and Australia in security cooperation in the region? And how can we together ensure security cooperation of the entire area? Now, our panelists today, I will invite the first of the panelists, Ms. Sarah Kirlew, the Consul General for Australia in Chennai. She's a career officer with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. She has previously served in Beijing, New Delhi, and Cairo. In Canberra, she has worked in a range of Indo-Pacific focused foreign and diplomatic policy roles within the department, including an Australia strategy for the Indo-Pacific and geoeconomic issues. Ms. Kirlew holds a master. She is a Master of Public Policy and Management from the University of London and is a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Sydney. May I therefore invite Ms. Sarah Kirlew, the Consul General for Australia, to kindly address the gathering. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much for that kind invitation, and good morning, everybody. Can you just wave at me to confirm I'm audible? Thanks.
Yes, ma'am, you're very clear.
Excellent. So I'd like to start by acknowledging my erudite fellow panelists, Vice Admiral Muralidharan and Professor Ian Hall, and of course to thank colleagues from the Centre for Public Policy and Research for convening us today. We've enjoyed a very strong partnership with CPPR, including under the Australia-India Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. And I have to say that being gathered here on Zoom takes me back to the early days of my posting, which were during the COVID pandemic here in India, when so many of our engagements were on a virtual platform. So I was asked to speak on the geopolitical challenges, threats and opportunities in the Indo-Pacific, and also how countries, particularly Australia and India, can work together to maximize opportunities and address those challenges. You know, of course, our viewpoints, all of our viewpoints are shaped by our own personal history and location. So the Vice Admiral was kind enough to run through my career history, but I have mostly had postings in the Indo-Pacific region. And now I sit here in Chennai, India's major Indian Ocean capital. I joke, I look across the water to the city of Perth, Australia's Indian Ocean capital. Maritime issues have really been forefront of the security challenges I've looked at and considered in this posting. For some time, I was also responsible for our relationship with Karnataka, with Bengaluru, where there was a cyber dimension as well to the security work that we did. But in my remarks today, we'll have a particular maritime focus. You know, concepts in diplomacy take time to evolve. I was in our headquarters in Canberra when our last foreign policy white paper was released. And that was really a point where, for Australia, we introduced the Indo-Pacific region as a geographical concept, as a real kind of central part of our lexicon. And when we did that, we were quite clear that there were sort of 3 stages we needed to go through. We had to convince people, first of all, that the Indo-Pacific was a thing, right? That it wasn't Asia and the Pacific, that it wasn't West Asia. It was actually one unified strategic concept. We also needed to think about, well, if we have it, what do we want for it? What are the values and norms that we want to see entrenched in this Indo-Pacific? You know, we want a region that is open, that is stable, that is prosperous, where sovereignty is respected, where might is not right, where countries work collaboratively together to solve the challenges of our time. So that was the vision that we had for this Indo-Pacific region, which Australia defines as running from India's west coast through Southeast Asia at its core, up through North Asia and across to the United States, and of course down through our own very dear Pacific neighborhood. Other countries have slightly different definitions. kind of is neither here nor there, because what we want to agree on is the vision and the values. But even a vision and values are not enough. You also need a strategy to know how you're going to get there, which means you have to take a frank look at the challenges you face, the roadblocks and the opportunities. So, that was something that I had worked on quite a lot during my last tenure in Canberra. And in the 3 years since, I think actually those challenges have become more acute, partly, in fact, because we've seen, the resumption of a land war in Europe with Russia's unjustified invasion of Ukraine. We have seen the outbreak of conflict in the Middle East in a very kind of devastating way in both Israel and in Gaza. We can see that globally military power is expanding, but the rules that govern that haven't really changed. And the ones that are there are under pressure. We've also seen the use of coercive trade measures, which we sometimes call geoeconomic coercion. No longer can we say that we can take our economic policy and put it in a separate silo to our strategic policy. They are intertwined and inextricably interlinked. Disinformation and misinformation taking us into that cyber domain, but also the way we all consume information, be it by social media, be it by more traditional media products. And, trying to establish that fact and that truth is increasingly difficult. And of course, we cannot ignore, particularly with COP going on, that climate change is heating our planet. So while we are dealing with these strategic challenges, also we face more natural disasters. We face the impacts, which disproportionately impact those who live in less developed areas. I also wanted to stress the importance that we place on major power competition being managed responsibly. It can be, and it must be. Through that, competition can be prevented from escalating into conflict, but we cannot take it for granted. There have to be active steps. So if I then move to you, what do we do? What is the strategy to create this region that we want to see? The Vice Admiral talked of a human security approach. I'm a bureaucrat at heart, and so I tend to think about who is doing what are the actors in the system, what is that Australia can do individually, what do we do bilaterally with countries like India, what is it that we can do minilaterally, which is a term that we use to encompass things like the Quad, like our trilaterals, and what can we do regionally or multilaterally with larger groups of countries. And against all of that, we also think, well, it's not just between governments, right? There is a role here for business, there is a role here for civil society, and also as governments, we must create the legitimacy for our actions that bring our populace along. Individually, Australia is investing in elements of our national power, and we need to think about how we define that. What is it that Australia brings to the stage? We sometimes refer to ourselves as a middle power. We are a large economy. We are a large economy that fuels and supplies much of the world. So we have an economic strength. Diplomatically, we are, I think, agile, we are creative, and we have a good reputation as an honest broker. And what the government is also doing is investing in our defense capabilities to back that in. Probably the most striking of those announcements in recent years has been our intention to acquire conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines, which will be the biggest defense investment in our history. But we also had this year the 2023 Defense Strategic Review, which I would commend to all of those of you with a deep interest in international relations. It is a very well thought through and quite frank document that looks at Australia's strategic posture and what we will need to do, and in particular seeks to realign our capabilities through the acquisition, say, of long-range strike systems and through the upgrading of our northern bases. And the Vice Admiral talked there about also the importance of our islands between Australia and India for a range of reasons. Moving perhaps next to what we're doing bilaterally, and I'm going to focus here on India rather than any of our other relationships. I was in Delhi recently for the Foreign and Defence Ministers 2+2 meeting. I had a posting in India 10 years ago. At that stage, we talked about, maybe we'll get to a point where our foreign and defense secretaries will meet in a 2+2 format, but we saw even that as a stretch goal. Now, Australia and India, I think, have one of the deepest relationships that India has with anyone. We are comprehensive strategic partners. Our prime ministers have a commitment to annual meetings. We have the 2+2 foreign and defense ministers meeting. We have an economic ministers meeting. And we have a free trade agreement. I think the only other country that has that same suite of commitments with India is Japan. So there I was at the 2+2 reflecting on how life changed, and also how as diplomats some things stay the same. Back at Hyderabad House, that beautiful gracious building where India hosts meetings like this, but the quality of the conversation is different now, right? You know, the way that Australia and India has come together is very striking. The things that we are doing, the depth of our defense engagements. Some of that can go in the public statement, and I do recommend you read that joint statement, not least because I had a hand in that negotiating some of the paragraphs, so you'll find some elegant prose in there to enjoy. Once a relationship gets to that point, it comes at leaders within our Indian network like myself. You find a spinning off point. You find a point where, as a diplomat, I cannot be sure that I know the granular detail of every single thing that is happening between our two countries. And that's actually a very good thing, because it means that our institutions now have developed to the extent that they have interlinked relationships with each other that do not need to be mediated and promoted by the Foreign Service. And I see that now in many areas of our engagement with India. You know, there's a long list of things that we have: maritime talks, defense policy talks, 1.5 track strategic dialogues, a very long list. And you will all be intersecting with those in different ways to I am. And I encourage you to take the opportunities that come to you to do so. When it comes to maritime security, most particularly the role of my consulate here in Chennai has three facets. First of all, we do what we can to facilitate uniform to uniform engagement. And the Vice Admiral knows well the close relationship between the Indian Coast Guard and our Australian Border Force, between the Australian Navy and the Indian Navy, probably the most developed flank of our defence relationship. And I had the great pleasure of being in Visakhapatnam last year when 1,200 Australian military personnel came for an Indo-Pacific Endeavour visit. One of our largest ships, our landing dock, the Adelaide, as well as the Anzac were there. And it was really quite something to see how close the relationship was. And I had the opportunity to spend time with a lot of the Indian naval officers who were hosting my people, and they had all been to Australia, right, for some exercise, for some training course, for some ship visit. And once you have that familiarity, of course, you can build from it for strategic intent. The other thing that my consulate does is sort of more at the human security end, in that we have a strong stance against people smuggling, and we work closely with the authorities in Tamil Nadu to make sure that particularly the Sri Lankan refugee community that lives here knows the risks of those very, very dangerous ventures. To take a small boat from here to Australia, drowning is a very likely outcome, and we want people to know that taking that journey means that, you know, there's zero chance of permanent migration to Australia, but you're risking your life and certainly you're risking your money to do that. And we enjoy good cooperation from the Indian authorities on that element. And then the third thing that we do in the maritime security domain is supporting growth in maritime security dialogue between our two countries, including by participating in events like this, by sponsoring some of them through the AIIPOIP grant scheme. We know that government can't have all the answers. We rely on people who have more time to devote to these issues, to go deeper, to bring us good ideas on what we should do next. Very quickly, you know, moving through multilaterals, the Vice Admiral already spoke about the Quad and how that's growing, and also the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative and the good work that that's doing. On the Quad, I just want to make the point that it is important to understand the Quad is not a military alliance. It is not a treaty. What it is a grouping of countries that share a vision and which have a positive and proactive agenda for the region across a very broad range of issues. And I think the work that was done amongst the Quad partners to ensure that everyone in Southeast Asia and the Pacific had access, if they wished to a COVID vaccine is probably the most striking example of that. And with the region, Australia still puts a great deal of importance on our relationship with ASEAN and with the Pacific Island Forums and the countries that comprise those two groupings. They are crucial to the region that we want to see. And maybe just to plug that Australia will host the Indian Ocean Conference in Perth from 9 to 10 February next year. We are hoping very much that Foreign Minister Jaishankar will attend that. I think the chances are high, along with a number of other foreign ministers, of course hosted by my foreign minister, and that is open, I believe, now for registrations from interested persons. So do look it out. Perth in February is a lovely place to visit, and I'm sure the conference itself will be very rich in terms of discourse and discussion. I'm going to finish here because I do hope that we have time for some questions and interactions, but the challenge that we face are very multifaceted. The actors are very diverse, but the things we can do are positive, are proactive, and I look forward to the conversation today, perhaps feeding to me and to my colleagues some new good ideas on where we should be looking next. Thank you. Back to you, Vice Admiral.
Thank you, Consul General. And you're speaking of interaction between our maritime forces. Took me back many years, way back in '77. I was fortunate to be part of a Australia, India, New Zealand naval exercise, where we had your Australian naval ship Melbourne, which is a sister ship of our old Vikrant, as well as the Brisbane and the New Zealand ship Canterbury. And we had an excellent exercise off the west coast of India. I'm talking way back in '77. So that's kind of interaction Australia and India have had. And I think as we'll take on the question, we'll see how we can take it further forward. Now, I will move on to the next panelist of ours, is Professor Ian Hall. Is a professor of international relations at the School of Government and International Relations at the Griffith University in Melbourne. He's an academic fellow of the Australia-India Institute of University of Melbourne. Prior to his appointment at Griffith, he actually taught at the University of St. Andrews, the University of Adelaide, and the Australian National University. He has been co-editor of the Australian Journal of International Affairs between 2018 to 23. He's held visiting appointments at the Australian War College, at the Nanyang Technological University, and the University of Warwick. His research mainly focuses on India's international relations and Indo-Pacific affairs. He's authored and edited several books, which includes one, the prominent one being the Modi and the Reinvention of the Indian Foreign Policy, which is brought out in 2019. His research papers are published in most reputed international journals, and he's also been a regular participant in Track 2 dialogues. And something that may interest this audience here is that he's also very proficient in Hindi. So may I request the professor to take on. Over to you.
Vice Admiral Muralidharan, thank you so much for your kind introduction, and thank you also to the Centre for Public Policy Research and Consul General Kirlew for her comments as well. Thank you for organising this event, CPPR. It's been a pleasure working with you on this particular project. So I've been asked to talk about some of the challenges that we face in the region, some of the ways in which we might collaboratively and cooperatively manage some of those challenges, and some of the changes that we've seen also in the relationship between Australia and India over the last decade or so. And the Consul General's already commented on this. I have not had the privilege of serving in the High Commissioner or in the consulates in India, but I have had the joy of watching from the sidelines this relationship develop over the last decade. And certainly 15 years ago, India and Australia had very little interest in each other. They had very little appreciation for each other's capabilities and capacity. And now that situation really is quite transformed. And we saw that in the warmth of the interactions in the 2+2. And I think we'll see that going forward as well, the establishment of the 1.5 track strategic dialogue and so on. So Vice Admiral, you made some comments at the beginning as well about the world in which we're living and the way that that's transforming the region. Comments that I think were very, very apposite and perceptive. We are seeing a region that is being changed. It's being changed by trade. It's being changed by investment. It's being changed by climate. It's being changed by strategic competition, which we're seeing manifest right across the Indo-Pacific region. And it's being changed by technology, of course, which is in some ways speeding up the impacts, exacerbating some of the impacts on us, on communities, on individuals, on societies, on states as well. And I think we do need to keep that frame in mind, that human security frame, which, as you rightly said, was launched 25 years ago as a way of thinking about or rethinking about security that wasn't just focused on states, but rather looking at the individuals on across a whole range of different areas, economic, cultural, social, the gendered impacts as well that we see, and looking at the impacts on individuals and cultures and societies and so on. That's very important. It's very important because in the maritime space, there are close linkages between resource competition, just at a community level, and strategic competition between states. And Vice Admiral, you pointed out at the beginning in your earlier remarks that things like UNCLOS, the law of the sea, and the changes that we've seen in the last few years in that regime, the establishment of exclusive economic zones has meant that resource competition has been in some ways escalated to a strategic level between states. And we're seeing that impact playing out in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, and of course in the Indian Ocean as well. So what are the challenges that we see across this region? Well, we've got challenges in multiple domains and they are connected and linked together. We've got resource competition that I've already mentioned, and some of that is about fish, obviously, but it's also about oil and gas. It's about deep sea mining. It's about offshore mining exploitation and so on. We've got climate impacts. We're seeing sea level rises. We're seeing the movement of animal fish species, which are having impacts on societies, changes in ecosystems, effects on peoples living in the littorals and also inland. We are seeing, as the Consul General alluded to, we are seeing some issues around organised crime, things like people smuggling, human trafficking, but also drug smuggling, weapons smuggling, and of course the scourge and the problem of modern slavery, which we see very much in the fishing fleets that operate certainly in the Pacific, and I think too in the area in the Indian Ocean as well. We've got the challenge of ensuring sea lane security. When so much of our trade does travel by sea, 30% of the world's trade going through the South China Sea, for example. So sea lane security is important, and managing issues like piracy, but also state-based threats to freedom of navigation and issues around control of those sea lanes have become much more salient than they were a decade ago and certainly 20 years ago. And then at the highest level, perhaps, we've got high-level state-to-state conflict or tension or competition having the potential to spill beyond land borders and into the maritime domain. And we need to recognize too that our maritime spaces are increasingly crowded with Coast Guard vessels, but also with naval vessels. And we're seeing states projecting power, projecting their capabilities far beyond their borders in ways that they were just not able to do, again, a decade ago or 20 years ago. So it's not just the South China Sea or the East China Sea that's increasingly crowded. The Indian Ocean is crowded too, with ships from, say, the People's Liberation Army Navy, as well as those navies that, if you like, are resident in the region. So what are our interests, I suppose, between Australia and India, or shared interests that we have in this space? I think you can set out many of them, but I'll put them under three headlines: the stability, security, and sustainability. In the stability area, we need to ensure that we have not just rules, but also predictability, that we don't see sudden and unexpected changes, that we're not seeing both attempts at undermining the order that we have or undermining the territorial or maritime arrangements that we have through the use of grey zone tactics. But we also need to guard against just the slow deterioration of circumstances which could come about through human or non-human impacts, through things like climate change. So ensuring that the rules are there, ensuring predictability, ensuring stability is really very important for both of our countries, and ensuring that we don't see the impacts, either human or non-human, on those arrangements. Security, of course, is a shared interest. We're both dependent on maritime trade, both Australia and India. We both depend on having secure sea lanes through the Indian Ocean, but also through the South China Sea and elsewhere into the Western Pacific as well. And so we need to ensure that we ensure that those sea lanes are kept free, and that they are not subject to control of one state or another, or a contest for control over those spaces, as well as defending our territory and, of course, defending our exclusive economic zones, which for Australia is a very significant challenge because Australia has a huge EEZ stretching right the way around from the Indian Ocean into the Southern Ocean and out into the Pacific, as well as to the north as well. And we need to also assist island states, particularly the small island states of the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean region, to be able to secure their own territory as well as their own EEZs as well. And I'll come on to what that might entail in a moment. And the last interest that we have, the last shared interest, I think, is about sustainability. We've got to ensure that livelihoods, that cultures, that social arrangements that in some areas have persisted over thousands of years, that those livelihoods and cultures and societies are going to be sustainable. And that requires us to look into questions about the overexploitation of particular resources, the impacts of new exploitation of gas and oil and so on. It means that we've got to have conversations about reducing the impact of many of the things that we are doing, including the impact of climate change on these communities. So, and this then goes back, of course, to this whole question about change, about predictability, about ensuring that we don't see sudden and unexpected changes having a major impact upon the region. And we know that shocks where livelihoods are taken away in the maritime domain, like fishing, for example, that we've seen severely impacted off East Africa in the last 20 years, we know that those impacts can then translate into increases in piracy, in trafficking, and in a whole number of other exercises in organised crime. So what do we need to do to meet these various different challenges? Well, Consul General has already spoken about capability in the Australian context. We've got to build the capability in our coast guards, in our navies, and also in the air as well, in order to be able to manage various different security challenges that we're going to see. But we've got to assist other countries in the region to also have the necessary capabilities to manage these various different challenges. And that means that we need to be looking at the training, the equipment, also the sustainability and the sustainment of capabilities in small island states and medium-sized states and middle powers across this region, and all of us looking to ensure that we can secure our own areas, our own maritime domains, and so on. That's too going to require information. And one of the positive developments of technology in recent years has been the ability for us to gather and transmit much more information about what happens in the maritime domain than we've ever seen before. And Australia and India collaboratively, bilaterally, but also in the Quad and other mechanisms, are improving our awareness of what is happening in the maritime domain across the Indian Ocean and across the Indo-Pacific more broadly. We've got to as well have some resilience. We are going to see shocks and unexplained or unexpected changes, and we've got to ensure that when those shocks occur, that we have resilient systems in place in order to be able to have the means to manage those shocks when they occur. We've seen the impact of unexpected developments just in the last few years. The impact of COVID-19 on tourism, for example, in island states in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean were very significant, and they had knock-on impacts, not just economic and cultural, but also political. And we need to ensure that these impacts are moderated and managed better into the future to ensure that we don't see the kind of instability that we've seen in recent years. And then last but not least, we need to cooperate and we need to work individually as well on ensuring that all states in the region that are independent and are sovereign have the capacity to exercise that sovereignty, that they're able to exercise independent choices, that they are autonomous, that they're free to make choices, and that choices are available to them. So that when they're looking for investment, for infrastructure, there are multiple different parties that they can look to provide what it is that those countries need. And that we're listening to what is needed by those countries and what people who rule those countries and live in those countries, what they want, not just what we think they should have. So in terms of cooperation, then, that cooperation can be bilateral, and the Consul General's already spoken about all of the various different initiatives that we're doing together bilaterally, Australia and India, and the recent 2+2 statement detailed a number of those. Of course, we can cooperate in platforms like the Quad. The Quad's wonderful advantage is that it's flexible. Essentially, anything can be brought to the table, anything can be put on the agenda. We can talk about all kinds of different things that we can do together. And that's one of the reasons why we've seen the Quad's agenda shift and change so much over the last years. And that flexibility is a great strength, I think. And of course, there are multilateral platforms, things like IORA, for example, that we can use as well to further some of the objectives that we have in the region, to secure our interests, to cooperate together, and also to build up the autonomy and independence of regional states. And the other thing that we can do, and often this gets forgotten, I think, is sometimes what we're already doing in some places is working quite well. And we don't necessarily need to add in another party or another group of countries in order to get the outcomes that we want. So conversations, just talking in these platforms freely and frankly, and indeed in second track exercises like this, are really important, because it allows us to identify areas where we can share burdens and where we can get out of each other's way, where we can deconflict and do a good job, having worked through the different options and concluded that perhaps what we're doing individually is good enough and providing the kinds of outcomes that we need to provide. So as I said at the beginning, I'm really, really pleased to be invited to talk today. It's been a pleasure already interacting with everyone here, and I hope these comments were in some way helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. I think you've covered the entire gamut of things and how we can cooperate on many issues and what are the underlying facts. I would now request the audience to ask their questions. Either Anushree, how do you want to tackle it? You want to go to the questions which are there in the chat box, or do you want the individuals can say their questions?
Yes, sir, we can go it either way. I think Rishi Atre has raised his hand. Maybe he can ask his question, and then maybe we can also take a few questions from the chat box.
Yeah, okay. Please come on, mute yourself and identify yourself, and you could ask on your questions. Rishi, are you there?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah,
I'm very much
there. Yeah,
sir,
please go ahead with it.
Sir, I'd say the number of questions, sir. Sir,
yeah.
Sir, can you hear me? A few questions.
Yeah,
First of all,
hear you.
Madam Consul General, may I start by saying I am also an alumni of Flinders in Adelaide. So, okay. And may I then say that Australia is part of the Northern Quad along with India, Japan, and USA. It is also part of a Southern Quad along with France, New Zealand, and USA. Kindly comment on the relative importance of these two quads. Okay, that is one question. The other thing is the question to Dr. Hall. Dr. Hall, I've read your book, sir, and you talk about the Modi government and Hindutva and the reason for being more militant in the Balakot airstrikes. But you also say that there is an underlying common thread in India's foreign policy in your book. Another scholar, Dr. David Brewster, also said this, this Dr. Jaishankar, the current foreign minister, when he was a permanent undersecretary, the civil service head, Mr. Humphrey, if I use the word of the Foreign Office, before becoming Mr. Hacker, that itself showed that India was taking a realist view. So do you really think political parties or Modi or Hindutva really have more influence in the underlying strategic thinking in the country? Thank you, sir.
Consul General, you could answer the first part, then we'll move it to the professor.
Sure. So you were asking about the difference between the Quad, Australia, India, Japan, and the US, and a sort of Southern Quad of
yes, ma'am.
Australia, US, yeah, France and New Zealand. I mean, I think they're different, right? Including in the scope and scale of the ambition that we have for them. So Quad Leaders meeting, I think we can all expect that there will be a Quad Leaders meeting in 2024. They've been meeting every year, and there's a very detailed work plan of action that goes on within the Quad. With the other group of countries, I mean, so Australia and the US are treaty allies. They are our only treaty ally, and our defense relationship is extremely close with them. Probably no better example of that than AUKUS. With France, we work in a number of different unilateral groupings. One of the most prospective actually is Australia, India, France, right? Given our shared interests in the Indian Ocean. And then our relationship with New Zealand is close, but of a different character again. Particularly, I think few people understand just how open the relationship is between Australia and New Zealand in terms of migration and economies. We have something called a closer economic relationship with New Zealand that really operates something as an extension of the two economies together. So with New Zealand, I think we particularly value their insights into the Pacific. They have very deep relationships of their own with those countries, and a close kind of, they use the word term one, or family links. So I don't think it's perhaps productive to compare those two groupings because they're trying to do different things. But I will say that, and I see there's some other kind of questions in the chat group which are kind of related, about the Commonwealth, about the Five Eyes. What I would say is that the challenges we face in the world at the moment are sufficient and significant enough that we need to be working in all the groupings that we can. So where we find a common purpose, we should come together. That requires a lot of diplomatic effort, actually, and resourcing to do that and to deliver on that. But it is important. And I think I'm actually quite often asked to kind of compare or value or rate one grouping above the other. And I think it's false. I think we need to actually be leaning in wherever we can, wherever we find common purpose to deal with slices of challenge, because there's no one answer or one person that can deal with it all at once. Thanks.
Thank you. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you. And thank you for the question and kind of picking up some things that I talked about in a book and I wrote back in 2018, five years ago. I was just finishing off writing this book, and so much has been transformed in the last 5 years that I feel like it's not really contemporary history anymore. It's more like ancient history, I think. This question about the effect of the ideology has on foreign policy is one that is debated pretty much in every democratic country around the world, as well as, of course, in sort of non-democratic states where ideology is very prominent. I think in the book, and I think I would kind of still stand by this conclusion now, my argument essentially was India's strategic situation, those strategic basics of geography, its economic strength in itself, but also relative to others. It's, to some degree, its political system and its openness to influence from others, the nature of its professional diplomatic service, the various different interest groups of the different departments and ministries, that all of those things have very considerable impacts on why India's foreign policy ends up in the way that it does. And there's it's very difficult for any party to come into power that might have very strong ideological views and shift that to a large degree. I think what we've seen, I can't second guess or kind of have a sense of what it is that India's leaders want, but I think there's been a very high degree of pragmatism. And there's also been a kind of an unusual degree, and I'm not going to ask the Consul General to comment on this, an unusual degree on the part of top politicians in India to rely on the advice of their professional officials and to take those officials very seriously. And obviously the position that Dr. Jaishankar has reached within the Indian system really reinforces that conclusion, that India's politicians are willing to defer to a degree, to learn from and to take the advice of their officials, and that's not surprising to me, given the very high quality of India's officials in the Ministry of External Affairs. But it doesn't happen in every democracy. A lot of the time, your officials will complain that they are pushed aside because the politicians think they know better. But I'm not sure that that's what we see in India, and not what we've seen over the last 10 years or so.
Thank you, Professor. I'll now request Professor Thomas, KV Thomas, to ask his question. Kindly unmute yourself and.
Yes, yes. Hello. Can
Yeah,
you
we can
hear
hear
me?
you. Yeah, we can hear you.
Good morning to you all. Good morning to Vice Admiral Muralidharan and the speakers. My question is to Dr. Hall. I have two specific questions. One question relating to the role of Five Eyes and how can Australia play a constructive role as a member of Five Eyes in safeguarding the maritime security and geopolitical interests of other countries in the Indo-Pacific region. And question number two relate to the UNCLOs. How far the UNCLOs and some of the articles of the UNCLOs like Freedom of Navigation Act, in which the big powers have the power for freedom of navigation through the territorial waters and the exclusive economic zone and contingent zone, how it will adversely affect the coastal states like Australia and India, with a particular reference to the economic, scientific and strategic interests of these countries. These are the two questions too. One may be answered by Dr. Hall.
Please go ahead, Professor.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for those questions. So look, on the first one, so I'm not a Five Eyes specialist particularly, but I mean, I think the advantage that the Five Eyes has brought to the various different, to the 5 countries that are involved in that relationship has been, they've been able over time, not just to get access to the information and the analysis that each one of their partners has been able to gather or produce over time on various different pressing issues. But the other thing the other advantage for Five Eyes has been burden sharing. Each one of the Five Eyes sits in a different part of the world, so geographically, and just for that, because of that simple fact, it allows every one of the Five Eyes at some point or another is awake and watching, if you like, and working and thinking. And we've seen this to some degree, I think, as we know from the public record in Ukraine, where the Five Eyes partners have been able to parcel up work and allow for 24-hour gathering and analysis to occur that's assisted each one of the other parties in how it looks at the Ukraine conflict and what's been happening. And it means that there's kind of seamless interaction, but it also means that there's some economies going on where not every country needs to be focusing on every issue all the time. Now the issue here, so the issue I think is how do you then, because information is you know, it is to a large degree power, how on earth do we create viable, productive, useful, trusted relationships with other like-minded states across the region in order that they can then benefit as well from the information that is gathered or from the analysis that is done? And I think that's the next big challenge. How do we work with countries like India, but also how do we work with countries like Japan or some of our Southeast Asian partners and others to ensure that we all have access to the information we need to make big strategic decisions over long periods of time, but also those to make decisions about fast-changing events, as the things that we saw in Ukraine in 2022, or that we've seen in Gaza, you know, more recently as well. So I think those are that would probably be the way that I would tackle that particular question. I think the second question I think was about ideology and so on. That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. That's
correct.
No, sorry. My second question is pertaining to this UNCLOs.
UNCLOS.
I see. Okay, yes, sorry.
Yeah, that another question Professor Thomas has put in is about how political party ideology has reference to geopolitical security or human trafficking or human security Indo-Pacific.
So I'm not sure. So I think, you know, I think on the UNCLOS question and on freedom of navigation, I do work with people quite regularly on maritime security issues, but I'm not a lawyer. So please don't ask me questions technically about how UNCLOS works or how that operates. But I think that UNCLOS was, I think, amongst all the conventions that we've seen since the end of the Second World War, it took longer to negotiate UNCLOS than practically any other. As a result of that process, that meticulous process of putting UNCLOS together, we have a set of rules and norms that are not perfect and they're not ideal, but they do provide us with a framework in which we should all be able to work. I think they're obviously, in the terms of how UNCLOS has been put into effect, and in terms of the support that's being shown by certain states, and here, I point to the United States not having ratified UNCLOS as being an ongoing challenge in terms of its legitimacy around freedom of navigation operations, for example. In these, however, what we have with UNCLOS is as good a framework as it was possible for us to get. And I think and a set of rules that we ought to be able to coalesce around and to help enforce and uphold in the region, and that are all very much in our interests. And so perhaps I might just leave it there.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. May I request the Consul General, would you like to comment on the UNCLOS issue? And also, you could cover the question, I think it's by screen name, it says Chennai. With increasing tensions in South China Sea, what are the initiatives taken to maintain human security? Maybe you could give your views on both these aspects.
Thank you. Yes, no question that the South China Sea is a vital waterway for many countries. And I think in your opening remarks, you both gave some of the stats around the percentage of global trade that passes through there. And so we definitely want to see a South China Sea where international law is respected and the rights of states are maintained, including under UNCLOS. So I would definitely echo what Professor Hall was saying, that UNCLOS is it's pretty good and it's what we've got. And it does give the protection for the legal rights and set the framework for how we use the maritime commons. So we do say that, maritime claims need to be consistent with UNCLOS, whether in the South China Sea or elsewhere. And Australia has very strongly backed the importance of implementation of, there was a 2016 ruling under UNCLOS on the South China Sea Arbitral Tribunal. If we sorry, I've lost the thread of my thoughts. FONUPs, you wanted to talk about whether we support FONUPs. I mean, we support the right of all countries to conduct legal maritime passage, to exercise those rights, and we are concerned at any behavior in the maritime domain that is unsafe. And there was a recent incident involving HMAS Toowoomba, an Australian ship, and a Chinese ship that sounded a sonar when our divers were in the water. And that was something that has deeply concerned my government. And there's been further activity on 9th and 10th of December involving the Philippines. So these are real issues which have real consequences for real people, real states. I think UNCLOS, we can get really into the legal detail, and Ian Hall was right to warn us off that, because what we really want to say is there are rules and norms of behavior that keep us all safe, that allow our prosperity to flourish because that maritime trade continues, that gives us a sense of security and sovereignty. And so I don't know if that quite answered the question. I'm just reading what I can see on the chat function again. USA has not ratified the treaty. I mean, yes, that is true, but it doesn't mean that we as Australia don't strongly support it.
Thank you, Consul General. I think, you and I, let me add my bit that UNCLOS is something that there are rules laid down for all of us to obey. But there are cases where it has gone to the UN and the International Court of Justice has given a particular ruling, but the country concerned says, no, this is a bilateral issue, so you have nothing to come forward to it. So it's all how much each nation tries to look into it. And it's like, while we all break, there are traffic rules laid down to the common parlance. If that is broken, there are ways that the police or the law enforcement authorities can enforce it. But in international relations and where things like UNCLOS laid down, it is not always possible to go with a stick and try and beat the person down. So it's up to all nations to try and cooperate and stick to the rules, because they are made for benefit of everyone. leave it at that because that itself unclaws itself with the topic by itself. And Consul General, I think there's one more question from Mr. Purushendra. As we're running short of time, I'm not calling people individually. It says, is Australia ready to invest in India, like mirroring US-India relations?
I did see that question, and I wondered whether invest was used there in an economic sense or kind of more broadly. I mean, clearly in terms of a broader investment in the relationship.
Mr. Purushendra, could you unmute yourself and ask, clarify your question? Mr. Purushendra.
Absolutely. Hi. Thank you for taking out the questions. It's broadly talking about the strategic terms, since we work mostly with the Australian government. It's also to do with technology and defense, especially with high tech, and thirdly, economic exchanges, keeping in mind critical and newer technologies and minerals. Over to you, ma'am.
Okay, so I could interpret the question then more broadly as a, one, will the Australian government be pushing growth in the bilateral relationship? And I think we've got a pretty good record there. Let me start with the economic. So we have a free trade agreement that entered into force last year. It is India's best free trade agreement, I would say, in terms of depth of coverage of any free trade agreement with a developed economy. Around 100%, very close to 100% now of India's exports to Australia enter our country tariff-free, and around 86% of Australian exports into India enter tariff-free. That's a kind of clearing out of the way by government to allow business to flourish, but we know it's not enough. So we also had an update to our India economic strategy. That strategy was, I think, published in 2018 and identified 10 sectors and 10 states where we thought Australian business should be looking harder at India. When we did the update, which was April last year, we backed it with a lot of government funding for new initiatives. So government also likes to be a bit of a gardener. We like to give seed funding and we like to watch projects grow. So that update to the India economic strategy was accompanied by new funding for collaboration in critical minerals. It continued funding for strategic research. There are separate funds on maritime security, on technology research. Across the gamut of our relationship, if you're wanting to do good work, there's probably a mechanism to assist. The other really important thing it did was establish our additional Consulate General in Bengaluru. So for most of my term, I was the Consul General for all of South India. But since July, I've had a very wonderful and capable colleague establish herself in Bengaluru, and she covers Karnataka and Telangana. So that's a doubling of our diplomatic resources in South India, quite a big investment. The other driver of the relationship between Australia and India that we haven't really touched on today are people-to-people ties. So Australia has a population of roughly 25 million people. Now 1 million of those people identify as having Indian ancestry. And it's really hard to overstate how crucial that is in terms of the two countries understanding each other and having that buoyancy in our ties. And around 7 lakh of those people were born in India. They're recent migrants. They've recently chosen to move to Australia and establish themselves there. And we see that as a really beneficial thing. And given there's been a bit in the Australian press on the migration review, I guess I should, at this point, emphasize that we don't expect any major changes in kind of the way that works between Australia and India, including because Indian students were given protected post-study work rights under the Free Trade Agreement.
Thank you, Consul. I think we are out of questions, but as we wind up, I have a question to the Consul General, to general views, and even Professor could comment on it. We are, like you said, our security cooperation between forces is increasing, joint exercises, etc. help. Therefore, do you feel that exercises like Malabar and Talisman Square will help enhance cooperation between the maritime forces, and in turn that kind of projects the kind of unity between nations, so that which will prevent crimes at sea? Your views, please.
I mean, I could just, it's such an eloquently asked question that I could just say, yes, I agree with your question and the premise that you put. Yeah, there are many exercises, and they are bilateral, they're multilateral, they're kind of across the Indian Ocean. They do send that signal to the region of our kind of shared intent. They have a practical purpose, right? They allow our militaries to operate together, to practice doing that in times of peace. And Professor Hall was talking about, he had a nice phrase that resilient systems are most needed when shocks occur. But of course, it's too late to create a resilient system when the shock is occurring. You need to have put that practice in beforehand. And it just builds that familiarity, that comfort of working together. And we see those exercises, of course, the sea-based ones, but land-based, amphibious, good exchanges also between our air forces. So I think in every direction they are growing, and they do send a signal of confidence to the region.
Professor, any views? And you could also give you a few concluding thoughts, if any, as we are running out of time.
Thank you. So look, I think, I wholeheartedly agree. Watching the development of the military relationship has been a real pleasure. It's gone from just to sailing together and learning how to work with each other and communicate with each other, to working in some areas that are sensitive and are technically difficult. So, things like maritime surveillance, for example, things like working on anti-submarine warfare and so on. These are really high-level activities that really only trusted partners work on together. It helps that we have compatible platforms. It helps that we have things like the P-8 aircraft, for example. But what really helps is the fact that we've built up over 10 years, certainly much more trusted relationships throughout all the services at multiple different levels. And you mentioned at the beginning there that I go and teach at the War College every year, and every year there are Indian officers there at various different levels in Canberra. And every year it's a pleasure to work with them as well as their Australian counterparts, and they're there, building that relationship at a human level.
Thank you, Professor. I think in conclusion, I would like to say that the bilateral cooperation between Australia and India in various fleets, including in the security aspect, is something that needs to grow, and we need to further it. It will be for the common good of keeping our Indo-Pacific totally open and free for all. And one of the areas that you can cooperate with all this is on the maritime issues. One of the most important things is getting awareness of the maritime domain, or what we today is termed as maritime domain awareness, which India has set up an international fusion center at Gurugram near Delhi. You can get a complete overview, and there are many participating nations who are giving there. So the development of threat can be foreseen and passed on to the concerned authorities, who could then take action and prevent it from happening. And also on humanity, what we call as the disaster relief, what we call when there are cyclones, other developing, you could inform each other. That is the area of cooperation across the Indo-Pacific that we have. And I think I would like to conclude by saying that we must strengthen our bilateral cooperation, both strategic, maritime security, and economic cooperation on all aspects. It is something that two democracies which are at either end of the Indo-Pacific can go to ensure that the entire area becomes free and open. Over to you, Anishi.
Thank you, Vice Admiral Muralidharan, sir, moderating an insightful discussion. Thank you, Ms. Sarah Kirlew and Professor Jan Hall, for your insights. So I think the discussion has so very well captured the various geopolitical challenges in the Indo-Pacific region and the prospects for growing cooperation between Canberra and New Delhi. So it was a real honor to host you all today. Thank you all the participants for logging in and listening so intently and for your questions. At CPPR, we look forward to more fruitful engagements with you all through our webinars and conferences. Please follow our website and social media pages for further updates. With this, I would like to formally close today's proceedings. Wish you all a lovely day ahead. Thank you all.